So the webcast today, as it will be around SAP RISE, we'll discuss a lot about the business case for RISE, but also some of the considerations and the pros and cons of when you are considering RISE of the alternative. I'll dive into the agenda in a second, but again, first of all, welcome to everyone. So yeah, let's get started.
Yeah, but as we said, we will sort of look into, so RISE is not a completely new construct, but it's being marketed as one. But there are pros and cons, and the focus of today's webcast was to sort of bridge the knowledge gap that exists, especially for existing SAP clients, where the choice is has bigger implications than just moving to a new license model. There are a number of considerations in terms of the assets you already have and so on. And also, given that this would be a conversion of what you have, there are risks, of course, some benefits as well. But in order to discuss a TCO and the pros and cons, we wanted to sort of provide a structure to address that in a stringent way to make sure you cover all the bases and avoid some of the big surprises that could arise if you're not sort of anticipating some of the implications of moving to a cloud structure. So we wanted to cover that today, and we'll sort of take it step by step. But Albert, if you'll just take us through the agenda.
So we've organized this into 6 key questions that we believe is some of the important ones to address when you are looking into considering RISE. First of all, we're going to touch briefly on the deployment model, basically whether or not also RISE is the correct strategic choice of platform for you. If you are, a lot of the clients here will look into an S4 conversion in any case, and also using that as an opportunity to evaluate whether or not to use RISE or to use an on-premise model or maybe even another vendor. This is not a SAP or ERP sourcing strategic webinar, but we will touch upon this briefly because there are some very central principles that will also guide whether or not RISE is a very relevant choice for you, or whether or not an on-premise scenario in particular is something to consider. Then we'll touch upon the functionality here, because RISE comes, as you say, with some of the stuff we know, but it also comes with some new functionality, and I believe SAP call it transformation as a service. We'll dive a little bit into that and also give you some guiding principles on, basically evaluating whether or not all these components do have some business value for you, or whether or not you should, try at least in negotiation of RISE to ensure that you are evaluating it on the right terms. Then we'll touch upon a very important topic, which is the TCO of RISE and how we build a business case around RISE to ensure that we take all the license component, but also all the adjacent components in RISE that you need to evaluate in order to have a TCO and compare it against an on-premise scenario, for instance. And of course, one of the key components here is that with RISE, you are getting the infrastructure and you are getting SAP Basis as a managed service, and you sort of need to evaluate that against the scope and cost of what you have today. And we have a lot of details basically on that, but for instance, one being that the SAP Basis scope is also changing slightly when you move into RISE, and you need to, well, first of all, be aware, but also if it does apply, that you need an additional support scope to be able to support the new SAP Basis, or at least to what's the word for it? So
there are some gaps in some of the services. So you're buying additional services to sort of bridge what many of you would consider constitutes an SAP Basis scope.
Exactly.
But we'll get into the details of that, of course, so you have an idea of what we're talking about.
Exactly. Then we'll touch upon the user licenses and this FOE-based model and whether or not where there is a license risk and how you mitigate it. And then we'll briefly in the end here touch upon some of the very important terms and conditions there is when you are moving into a cloud-based solution, because there is a large changing paradigm of terms and conditions. We cannot cover them all comprehensively here, but we will touch upon.
Yeah, we've taken a list of sort of the main ones, and if you have had a chance to look those over before you potentially sign with SAP, you will be in a better place. It will not cover everything, but those are some of the main issues with regards to the cost commercially, but also security, PPA, that sort of stuff. But we'll come back to that. And then finally, how do you sort of broker a deal, and how would you structure your negotiation with SAP, and then what sort of leverage is RISE bringing to the table, both from the customer's perspective, but also from the SAP sales team, who are very eager to position RISE as an interesting alternative.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a negotiation webinar. We have a very separate one, especially on negotiating SAP, but we will touch upon some of the relevance here and also what is relevant for RISE.
Yes. Well, let's get started.
Yes. Diving into the first one here, the deployment model. So I think the first main observation here in regarding to whether or not to choose RISE is to evaluate if it is the right deployment model. And I think the main point here we want to stress is that, you know, one size does not fit all. So all ERP customers are different, and you also differ in a lot of very central elements that will determine the optimal ERP platform for you. So what we see here behind us is that we've tried to map based from our database, you know, first of all, the database size of a lot of the clients, and also behind Frederik and I here, the overview of the amount of custom developments that is across clients. And what we want to say with this is that, of course, clients vary, you know, greatly in terms of, you know, how customized the solution is, and of course also how big they are.
Yeah. So the main point here is it's just that you narrow the number of scenarios you might realistically want to consider. And so you're able to sort through the marketing push that you'll no doubt be facing. Simply because, so if you have large customization needs and are moving those thousands and thousands of hours worth of development that you've invested in your platform, and that needs to be moved into a brownfield implementation of SAP, there might be limitations to some of the cloud offerings or specific deployment models at least. And simply simplifying your the number of scenarios you and the rest of the management group will ideally want to consider makes a lot of sense, because you'll have a lot of choices in this process, regardless of how you approach it. So we will just sort of encourage you to simplify that decision where you can, because enormous amounts of choice here does not necessarily make for better decisions.
No, and I think this is basically the same point here. You just see you do differ in system complexity, process maturity. Here we've indicated it through the number of incidents, you know, and a year here that our clients is basically, you know, the point here is that, you know, whether or not the platform you choose and the amount of the degrees of freedom you have to influence the stability for it, and to manage all the dependencies to third parties, and that will differ greatly whether or not you're choosing SAP RISE, for instance, in terms of some of the others.
But might also just impact, are you coming from a very stable platform, or have you been through a big project where you're still sort of transitioning into a steady state scenario with declining incidents and so on? So the backdrop for what sort of deployment model and the pros and cons, operationally speaking, you might want to consider is different as well. So there is a number of issues here, and that means that it's slightly greater than just buying new licenses. It actually impacts the operational model and the sourcing strategy around the support that you will need. A few very eager sales teams at SAP has sort of positioned RISE as a cloud solution, and because it's a cloud solution, there are no incidents. That's at least not our experience. That's the case. So we would recommend that you don't plan for total stability, even though you are moving into a cloud. That's not the reality we see, at least. Yeah.
Basically the same point.
Yeah. So basically, we sort of when you're approaching this, we like to sort of work with this in a number of scenarios. The TCO This is just us trying to simplify that, or at least I'm not sure we succeeded completely, but there is an ERP stack which constitutes, which is sort of compiled by the data center services, sort of the infrastructure layer, and of course the database operations, and then the ERP operations, which is in the SAP space, primarily SAP based. On top of that, you have some licenses, and then you will have some application management and maintenance activities. And those are sort of the layers affected by the choice of deployment models. So whether you're purely looking at, for example, an SAP-related scenario to continue from your ECC or your current SAP installation, or whether you're also considering this like more broadly, what might Oracle or Microsoft have to offer in the ERP space, it sort of makes sense to understand the differences. So this is also why statements where you say that SAP is more expensive than Oracle and Microsoft, well, that is true for some of the layers, but it very much depends on what you need and how it's structured, whether this is a universal truth or not.
It's not a rule of thumb.
No. So you sort of need to understand how the structures differ a little bit. So in the SAP space, there are a number of deployment options. The scenario we've put in place here is a classic one where you come from a SAP ECC setup, so you're not yet on S4. And then you have a number of alternatives. This is sort of a classic discussion, and that means that clients will consider whether continuing with an on-premise model simply by moving to an S4 contract is the right choice, or one of these cloud-based models. Cloud is not cloud, so there are private cloud options where you have you sort of have a dedicated environment. Is a simple way of putting it. That might also handle some of the issues with for clients who are concerned with GDPR and SCREMS2 related issues. The private cloud options might be a slightly more palatable setup, because fundamentally, or at least in some of the deployment versions, it is SAP who owns that data center, even though it might actually be a hyperscaler in the background. But for legal purposes, that might be a better structure for some. And then there is the public cloud ones, the public cloud options and the private cloud options are basically based on hyperscaler type infrastructure. The difference is how the environments are shared with other clients. The public cloud options are also less customizable. So you're very much, it's basically SAP HANA Cloud, and that also has some limitations in terms of functionality. So it's important that you also, all the great technical teams you will have in the background, they need to have need to have been through the solution roadmaps for the specific HANA deployment models. So if you have a need for customization, well, then pretty quickly you'll go past the public cloud options, which basically don't leave a lot of room for customization. And then you will have eliminated a couple of scenarios that is not really relevant for your organization. The private cloud options might make sense, and those take on a couple of different forms. The alternative to, for example, RISE, private cloud option, the yellow one on the sort of in the middle of the screen, that would be to for example, have a dedicated SAP certified infrastructure from AWS, Azure, or Google. And there you can buy HANA machines and have the scalability and move costs to OPEX rather than CAPEX, if that's something you prefer. So that is basically one where you're bringing your own licenses, but you have a platform which is provided by a hyperscaler. The RISE option, that is one where the operations, so the SAP basis, the platform, and the licenses are combined into a single structure, which is simpler, but also has some caveats. And the important part, the point with the layering here is that the ERP operations and the interface to the application maintenance tasks is not completely straightforward. So for those of you who have built organizations internally or have comprehensive outsourcing deals with some of the big vendors, TCS, HCL, IBM, Intelligent, so on. Well, they will have a slightly different take on the SAP basis scope. So we'll get back to that in a second to be much more concrete on that. But basically, these are sort of the main scenarios, and our point is whittle that down to a number of just a handful, because for most clients at least, it will not be the entire set of scenarios that will be relevant to discuss for you.
Yeah. And I think one input on that is basically, as you mentioned here, I'm just going to go further here. And an input on that is also just looking, first of all, generally at, what the difference will be, also just because of the difference will be between having it on premise and then hosting it in the cloud. One being, if we look into some of the elements now, we've outlined it here feature by feature. If we go down to the one that says infrastructure management, you see here, of course, you have it when you are choosing SAP RISE, that will be managed by SAP. That also means that the service scope here will be relatively fixed, meaning that aside from when you are having a partner in and can tailor your own SAP scope, SAP basis scope, that will not be the case with RISE. Some of these managed services here, you're sort of buying into a service scope scheme with some change requests that is sort of included on that, and not a lot of sort of wiggle room for you to tailor it to your specific needs. You might be able to, as we will come with, partner up with someone who can assist you in sort of doing some of the adjacent work or work on top, but the basic scope here will be fixed.
Yeah, and then just one point also, looking at some of the familiar people on the call here, the upgrades, managing the integration layer is not completely trivial. I can see a handful here who will know that intimately. So getting forced into the upgrade rotation that SAP dictates in a sort of a HANA cloud setup might not be for you. So just understanding the operational implications of that, but also the knock-on effects in terms of costs and resources deployed to service all the interconnected applications that sort of feed on the system. You need to take that into account to sort of understand the implications of that. So it's not that there are not benefits for that, but you just need to understand that. And then we try to make it simple here, but if you're looking at HANA Cloud, the pure version, that makes the most sense if you're sort of greenfield, a new SAP deployment, that sort of thing. Then that makes a lot of sense. The implementation costs are lower and so on. So, but for existing clients, the choice might not be as obvious. It might be some of these slightly more hybrid type models where you can have a bit more control, which is for you. And it also, in terms of rules of thumb, if you're a very big SAP client who has invested in SAP for 10, 15, 20 years, it might not be as simple as just simply deploying a cloud solution. So
yeah, and looking to some of the other elements as we discussed, if you are very customized, then deploying custom code is not, you don't have a lot of opportunities for that, or basically none if you're buying it completely as a cloud solution. That also gives some requirements to any of the add-ons which you want to take on it. And basically this is just elements that will, of course, greatly affect the TCO if you are considering this, but also, as we would say, we call it some guiding principles, because that should be your starting point to narrow some of these scenarios down.
Yeah, we'll just try to narrow it down rather than telling you about all the exceptions to these rules, of course. But yeah,
exactly. Then coming up, maybe the last point here, as you discussed, Frederik, here, the choice of platform is also, can be very dependent on, where you're coming from. If you are If it's completely greenfield and you are building something new, it makes sense. But as you say, Frederik, if you are coming already, from an existing very customized system which you want to upgrade, you do already have a lot of in-house capabilities, or you have a very strong partnership already for SAP basis support. You have a very large degree of customization. You have it placed on an infrastructure that you recently refreshed, when you have databases that runs cost effectively and all that stuff. Well, then maybe taking all of this and placing into a cloud solution, it's something that will greatly affect the TCO and maybe not the right solution.
Yeah. But this might just be a timing issue, right?
Maybe,
so if it's a life cycling thing, as we're sort of pointing out here, well, just take into account there's some complexity in that model, and also especially timing wise, to make sure you're not having too much sunk cost in your current environment.
Exactly. Yeah, and basically, as we said, use these principles here to narrow some of these down.
Yeah.
All right. Having touched upon that, should we dive in, particularly in the functionality to RISE here?
Definitely.
And to very briefly summarize RISE, well, basically here with RISE here, you get a deployment of S/4HANA Cloud. That is sort of the core still. And then what SAP is pushing here with RISE is that you also get some adjacent products and what they call migration support on the side. And what it is to if you take the complexity away from transformation as a service and look at the specific products in place here, well, then you, aside from the cloud ERP functionality here, well, you get the business network starter pack, which is a compress of a few software products and accesses. For instance, you get access to Ariba, the Ariba network with, I think it's a basic 2,000 documents from other Ariba clients. You get access to the Access Intelligence Network, and you get also access to the Logistics Business Network. But basically, this is, as they say, this is a starter pack. So per default here, you get a few licenses to sort of, if this is something for you, but it is a quite narrow scope in terms of the Ariba functionality, or I'll see if I can get us in here, or so the Ariba functionality, or what you would typically have in sort of asset management here. This is basically just access to, I think it's 200 equipment and 2 connections to other partners.
Yeah. So one point here is, for example, the last element, the business technology platform. So that, well, you're getting some credits for that, but basically that is a pretty potentially an expensive choice. So stating that you're getting that in RISE is maybe sort of,
well, that's what SAP
yeah, but that's maybe taking it a step too far, because they actually do intend for you to pay for that. It's its own product range and so on. But you get access to it. It's basically more integrated. Is sort of the push here.
And then you'll get a few implementation tools. You get the and S/4HANA readiness check, and you get the custom code migration app. And then you get a one-time report on process improvements and from the business process intelligence starter pack. And basically here, I think the takeaway here from our side is, basically what you're getting, if we boil it down, is that it is not very different from the S/4HANA Cloud, and you sort of need to evaluate the business value for some of the added services. Will you even leverage the business network starter pack? If you're already using Ariba, there will be an obvious overlap in the products. If you are, the migration tools that you will get, will, unless you are a very, very specific, very standardized client, you won't get a lot of value for that, just per se. You do need to go and make a partner, in any case with a large business partner, and probably you won't even leverage some of these add-on products you have. And then in the end, as Frederik says, the hosting here is basically just credits, and you're not certain whether or not you will get a better commercial deal if you are just to engage directly with the hyperscalers instead.
Yeah. basically, this is just a structure for convenience to some extent.
Yes.
But it might make a lot of sense to you, and also it is the model as it is easier to manage than some of the other ones.
Yes.
So,
but it should be viewed largely as the S/4HANA cloud in terms of the, you can say, in terms of the value you're getting from.
Yeah, just introducing a slight bit of complexity here just before we get to the sub-basis stuff.
Oh yeah.
Is that the RISE is also a license model. So some of you will have been presented by the SAP team with the fact that there is a sort of a gray area where the RISE license model based on these full user equivalence FUEs is adopted, but you're not actually buying the operational bit. That is a possibility, but today we'll try to focus on the pure model, but just for the ones who are curious about that, yes, there are exceptions, and yes, there are negotiated outcomes that you can sort of look to if this might be a better approach or you prefer this license model for whatever reason. Then one of the issues with RISE is that this is also, given that SAP at heart is a software company, the operational scope has always been something you need to be a little bit, just make sure whether it's aligns completely with how you would operate the systems. This has been true all the way back to Hana Enterprise Cloud and some of these predecessors to the RISE concept. There are many different areas where you need to look at this. We try to just simplify this a little bit, and this is sort of the simplest view of what we're talking about. But there is a number of what many would consider core services that's basically not included in the SAP basis operations in the RISE setup. And that is because some of that is add-ons and some is simply moved to the client side. Some of that is database optimizations. There are some monitoring activities, some installation tasks. There are some restore activities, that sort of stuff, where you might want to, in a traditional SAP basis definition, take it a few steps beyond what is in the scope of the RISE service. There are also some integrations they don't want anything to do with, which you or a partner needs to manage and so on. So our basic point here is that we could talk at length about this, but we just need to know that if you are stacking up your costs, and we'll get back to what that looks like in a second, but if you're stacking up your cost, you need to consider that the SAP basis support in the RISE model is probably slightly narrower than what you are looking for in the if you are having a one-to-one in terms of scope transition of what you have today. So basically, this is maybe not a completely fair representation of this, but if you're looking at broadly at the activities, around 30 to 40% of the full SAP basis scope is covered by RISE, and then you can buy another 40% or so worth of sort of optional services to cover or bridge that gap. But there will be a number of tasks which will reside on responsibility-wise on your side. And as we said, those relate to the integrations. So some of the application support areas you need to factor in that you will still have dependency on SAP basis teams. They might be internally provided or through a partner, but a good plan for considering RISE should take into account just the differences in the scope here. Yeah, so basically there is an offering. This is the typical way of showing this. So this is us maybe just circling back to SAP's way of talking about this. But they are RISE takes care of the sort of the software, the infrastructure, and the technical managed service. And the point before is related to the technical managed service, where we're saying that, well, some of that is slightly narrower than what you would like ideally to have. And with font size 2 at the bottom, you'll be able to maybe see that it says SLA and support. We'll come back to some of the exemptions in the standard cloud terms that might be an issue for you as a client, because SAP is trying to manage the operational risk, and that means that there are some ways of measuring the SLAs which might not make a whole lot of sense. A lot of you here on the call are third, fourth, or fifth generation outsourcing, and you will have worked with SLA and service credit models and so on. So one of the basic issues, operationally speaking, is that you need to work through these terms because the SLA calculation, service credits you will have available, those are calculated typically as a basis standard rules. Those are calculated based on a 6 months average. So that means that you might have had a very serious outage in January, but come June, when you are calculating the SLA implications for that, on the average, with no downtime in the 5 months leading up to the conclusion on the measurement, well, there might not be a big issue, and there is no implication. So obviously, you want to address some of the measurement definitions, as you would also in an outsourcing contract, where you would make sure that the incentives are in place to make sure that the operational risk is balanced between the two parties.
Yeah, so we're challenging a little bit the one-stop shop, narrative there is around, RISE for, not just when looking at the application maintenance, but Frederik said also when you will need, adjacent implementation support, and also you will probably need, some additional support in the operational layer to make up for some of the change scope, right?
Yeah, and SAP's counter argument to what we're saying here today is that, well, we have very clearly stated that the application management services, you're buying those for yourself. Well, yes, but in a conventional definition of this, some of the activities that we would consider being sort of the technical managed services, they should be related to that rather than being a sort of a hybrid paradigm covering application management. So this is us coming at this from a sort of an outsourcing perspective, and the way that the clients have traditionally brokered these services in the market.
Yes.
Yeah, but let's get to the TCO and being quite fond of numbers in our organization. This is of course something that we spend a lot of time on, so we will try to sort of illustrate some of the risks and also try to make this simple. Some of this is also common sense, but you do need to sort of understand the interface between the various categories here, and we'll try to give you an initial understanding of that. We cannot cover everything today, but we'll just applying a bit of structure here makes for a much easier conversation around TCO.
Yes. Then let me start by maybe the only slide here that will be without numbers on this. We have tried to, when you evaluate the TCO, we have tried to boil it down to the different components here that comprise the TCO, at least if you are going to evaluate it against an on-premise scenario, and just to put it in a few boxes in order to then put numbers on it and compare it one to one. And just maybe, let me just briefly take you through some of the main questions that we believe you should ask, and then we'll dive into a lot of examples. So on the left side here, we placed what we see as the full stack for both on-premise and the subscription-based model, all the way down from the licenses in the top, the user licenses you need to have in place, and the database licenses and engines and whatnot, down to the operational layer, to the infrastructure layer, and of course also down to any implementation, upgrade, or migration projects you're looking into. And some of the main considerations here you need to have is, of course, across the stack. If we take it from the top to the right, we're going to dive into these, but very briefly. First of all, of course, you need to have an idea about the main digital core licenses, I mean the user licenses, whereas you have there's one license scheme in the ETC, there's another on S4, there's also another one again in the cloud-based models, the FUE as we discussed, and of course also the scope of what is included in these licenses is changing rapidly, especially when you move from on-premise to the cloud, where the FUE licenses cover much more than the traditional ones. Then of course the digital access issue will still be there. We won't touch a lot upon that. But basically here you will still need to consider whether or not you have a model where you have either kept the digital access risk or mitigated any risk for future digital access claims when going forward.
Yeah, so digital access is something that we have discussed with many of you in various formats. So, but the fundamental takeaway in terms of RISE is that digital access is not an option in RISE; it's part of the structure. So realistically, what you're looking at is working with these unlimited licensing models that officially don't exist, but unofficially is very much part of what large enterprise clients are doing. So it's, whereas if you're at the on-premise model, some of you, we have negotiated these contracts where old indirect access terms and protections against sort of the third-party integration risk you have has been carried over into an S4 on-premise model. That's not really possible in RISE. It might be at some stage, but for now at least, we have not observed any RISE structures where in the Nordics that have incorporated that specific feature. But I mean, it might not be a big deal. It's just that you will look at a commercial settlement on curbing the digital access cost.
Then you need, of course, to consider the optimal license model for Hana. And if you are moving into cloud space, you also need to take into considerations. Are you coming from a place where you have right-sized the database for costs, basically to fit a particular license model and where you're coming from? And are you facing any issues around your use of databases if you are going into RISE or just another cloud model? And then also generally, in particular, if you're going from ECC to S4, but also going into cloud, you need to look at the engines you have and in the line of business products, and consider also what does this product conversion look like, because there will not be for all products a one-to-one comparable product you can use in the cloud. There will typically be, well, there will be a lot of upgrades, but also sometimes there'll be a change of scope or even change of resource unit for this particular engine. And we do see some where if you're coming from an ERP where you have some products that is at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 versions behind, that may not been a problem before, but it will be a problem if you're moving into a cloud model because you need to upgrade it. And then we've seen some cases where you will actually lose some of the functionality that you've originally had. Right?
And this is not, I mean, business-wise, it is if you're just looking not the cost, but at the sort of benefits, it is of course because a lot of these products are evolving quite fast, and they are coming from being maybe a retail or financial services solution that has then grown in size, and then some of the products are spun off into separate suites and products. But that does mean that for some of the clients who have been early adopters, they should carry some of those benefits into the new structure. So just be aware for some of those of you who have industry solution, as they're termed. This might be financial services applications in the banking or insurance or pension space. It might be the utility special products in the utility space, retail platforms, car post DM, that sort of stuff, and so on. But a lot of that is changing, and the cost of adopting the new metrics for large enterprises is substantial. And it's also an area where you can get some very, very high discounts. So just be aware, if you are an industry solution user, there are some very attractive conversion schemes you might want to consider and the worst case cost will not be the one you'll be facing, but you do need to negotiate because, of course, SAP is not completely turned into an NGO just yet, so they are still in it for the profits. But just be aware there are some serious possibilities of improving that transition.
Then going from the licenses, there is the operational layer, which we've discussed. You need to evaluate, the new support model you have from SAP Basis. If you're moving into the cloud or in the RISE solution, you need to evaluate your current cost on SAP Basis versus what you're getting in the managed subscription service.
Yeah, and for the complexity might arise in so the example that Albert is talking about here, for example, with the hyperscalers. For some of you, you'll have large engagements with the usual suspects in that space, Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. And that contract with the sort of discounts that you've been able to broker with the entire scope you have, that might be more attractive than the infrastructure cost you're getting from SAP. So in that particular area, there are some very hard caps on what sort of discounts they can give you on the platform. So there might be some arbitrage in for you to consider between your own large-scale contracts with these hyperscalers and what you're able to get through SAP. So just keep that in mind.
Yes, I think that's basically also here's the next point around the infrastructure cost. Having one being that you need to compare what you have in-house here to what you're getting in the FUE license. Another point being, as you just mentioned, Frederik, you may be able to get a better deal going directly and then negotiate with the hyperscalers. A third one is regarding the timing issue, which we addressed in the beginning, meaning that if you need to account for a lot of foregone assets if you are moving into the cloud. If you just life cycled a lot of the infrastructure here, you need to take that into account in your business case. Or of course, it may be a timing issue of ensuring that you're migrating at the end of a life cycle.
Yeah, and maybe just to make that a simple discussion, the point here we would like to make today is that aligning a RISE purchase with when you actually going live with that solution is very much possible. If you don't do that, you'll be facing a lot of double costs. We'll just show you what that looks like in a second. But it is possible to mitigate that risk.
And then, of course, the last point here just being the implementation upgrade project versus the cloud migration project you're facing, which is just another element here of the TCO. We won't touch a lot upon that, but just another element here, of course, that goes into building the full business case for it.
Yeah, we have a cost example for those of you who are interested in how we've broken that down. We've made a relatively simple structure for that just to make it a little bit easier for you to get started on sizing that project. But we have an example for you to look through a little later.
But these are the main elements. And then I think let's go into some of the examples.
Numbers. Yep.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, you will have a business case where you'll have a sort of a run rate cost, which you're evaluating. And then you'll have sort of the choice of looking at a RISE versus an on-premise alternative. You might have three. In this case, there are some different scopes considered. So a small, a medium, and a large one. And then there was, what does that cost look like in a RISE versus an on-premise setup? So in this particular example, we'll get back to why that was why the difference was so big. But it sort of comes back to the way it's calculated when you are looking at these models and using these FUEs, which are these full user equivalents, and sort of loosely translates into the user licensing that many of you will be very familiar with. But the FUEs also carry some of the costs for the operations. So some of the SAP basis stuff is factored into the cost of the FUE. The main difference between these two is, of course, that RISE is a subscription model, meaning that you are leasing, if you will, or renting both the licenses, so the access to the system, the usage, the infrastructure, and so on. So as long as you're paying, you have access to that. If you're not paying, you don't have access. and that makes for a bit of a slightly stronger login to SAP. On-premise, well, then there you're buying a perpetual license, so that means that you will forever be able to use that software. You also have the option to terminate this support. That might definitely not be for everyone, and that might be very much a short-term solution. But you do have that option. But that means that you will not have access to upgrades and all the regular stuff, but you do have access to the system. So there is a choice here, and especially for clients who have been on-premise and are considering RISE, just understand that the OPEX might be the same, but you are foregoing assets worth millions and millions of krona, euro, dollars, and just understanding the implications of that. The reason why SAP is more eager to get you on RISE is that it's subscription-based revenue, and the markets greatly value that much higher than the perpetual license sale, due also to the control and the reduced cost of operating standardized environments relative to supporting very customized installations. That's sort of the macro rationale behind this. So we'll get back to the incentive differences in a second, but in terms of the cost, what we've tried to do in this example is just to say that on the on-premise side, you do need to add in the infrastructure, the SAP basis operations, to get to the same cost. And when you do that, you'll end up with a cost. This is an average, so of course there will be an upfront payment for the licenses in the on-premise model that you don't have in a RISE setup because you're buying a subscription fee. So this is just a very, very simplified view of what a business case looks like, and just to sort of as a checklist for you to be able to move forward with that on your own terms. Some of you will have very, very long product lists that would be part of this, but this is just to simplify. So there will be pros and cons, whatever there is. We're just moving from the example before. You'll have a cost where you might want to consider these down-selected 3 scenarios. It might be on-prem, it might be SAP on a hyperscaler, and it might be RISE. For the sake of today, we'll just consider RISE versus on-premise. And then, so in whatever negotiation you'll head into, you might have 4, 5, or 10 levels where you are looking at optimizing that. Those are some examples of that are the ones we have on the left-hand side, where regardless of which scenario you go for, you would like to leverage some of the excess users you have. You would like to co-finance the subscription fees or the new license versions with the existing investments you've made. You might want to sort of right-size the SAP environment and also the licenses. And then, of course, it's always nice to get market prices. As the benchmarkers in the room here, we would always make a strong point for that. But a very important point is the last one. I'll get back to the details around that, but that is around what will RISE cost beyond the first contract term. Because if we're looking at some of the pros here and cons, some of the pros is it's a simpler implementation. Albert talked about that a little bit earlier. The operational model is sort of lean, and you don't have too many internal capabilities because you now have a sort of a managed service. So your stack and number of skills you're managing is reduced. Fundamentally, the SLAs are improved because you're in a very large-scale data center. So basic redundancy and some of those things are generally high, or very high, and the downtime on the specific infrastructure is not that likely. It's also easier to scale, and sort of the commercial flexibility fundamentally is sort of more flexible than the perpetual equivalent, in that you can scale up, you can buy more FUEs, you can scale up the environments gradually. And the basic structure here is more or less a carbon copy of IBM's smart cloud concept from 2014. And that is based on t-shirt sizes, where you sort of spec up your environments gradually as you expand and adopt, which is of course attractive in this sort of, this is a better way of implementing. So in terms of not having to buy an enormous SAP HANA machine, there are some definite commercial benefits in that during the first contract phase. Yeah, so sourcing landscape is also simpler. So because you're consolidating your infrastructure layer, so SAP basis layer, and also the licenses. So all of a sudden, the administrative burden of that is quite a lot simpler. So of course, that's definitely for many clients who are struggling in this area, that will be a benefit. Some of the cons, so typically business models will have pros and cons. Going through the cons here, which is given that today is a little bit about the risk here, you are facing some heavy lock into SAP. And that sort of gets to the next point. We've mentioned here that Office 365-like exposure. What that means is that you are settling on a subscription price for RISE, which extends for 5 years, for example.
Should we jump down to that example? I think we have.
Yeah, I think let's do that.
Yeah.
What that means is that RISE in most cases will be attractive in the first contract term. The standard cloud terms, this is the long 400-page document that most of you feel a bit, it's a bit of a burden getting through all of that, but SAP people like Albert and I are quite enthusiastic in sort of understanding what the changes are here. We do cheat a little bit. We have some text analysis going through the differences here. But what you will find out if you go through that is that the renewal terms for a RISE or a cloud contract of any sort that is based on the new structure, that implies auto renewal. That's a trick they learned from Salesforce. And the price for extending RISE, we don't know exactly what the price policy will be because of the concept, and we've supported quite a lot of these RISE purchases. But the renewal, what we can see from those contracts is that SAP, as a general rule of thumb, will have a standard renewal price. So you will have 3 to 6 months notice if you are changing the terms of the subscription model. So that means that you need to negotiate in due time. The big issue is the price for the renewal. So that will fundamentally be a 7.5% to 9.5% increase in price plus inflation. So for many large clients, it will be very important to just understand how the business case is changing in the second contract term. And that's because ERP purchases tend to be for a slightly longer horizon than a lot of the other things you have in your portfolio. So that you'll be committed to SAP for not just 5 years, but maybe 10 or even 15, 20 years. So for them, it's important to get you on the right model in the beginning. And lessons learned from renegotiating SuccessFactors, Concur contracts, Fieldglass, Ariba, and so on, is that the initial terms, also some of those might date back to your POC where you got a system for free. But if you sign those cloud terms, those will serve as a master agreement going forward. And that's an issue because that means that you will have an undefined risk at renewal if you move into RISE. So this is very much something you need to just address to be able to answer your management group about what does the cost look like in the long term. So just be aware that this is a consideration. And then looking at this sort of model, on-premise might be very unattractive in the first contract period if you're buying everything up front. But it might make more sense on average when you get further down the road where OPEX will structurally be lower typically than the standard RISE scenario. And then we can improve everything in various directions with negotiation. And you have a lot of leverage if you are considering RISE to improve that price a lot. That's important to say. So that will be for SAP a much more attractive scenario. But this profile is important for you to just be aware of.
Yeah, so basically two things to reiterate. There is the one with, if you are comparing it directly here, there's the one-time purchase, and then the lower OPEX if you are purchasing on-premise licenses, which then mean you need to look at it on the average. And also your point, Frederik, going with a long time span that may be what gives the lowest cost if you are depreciating these assets you're buying. The other one is that if you are on-premise, that also means that you do have the OPEX protected. Whereas, and it will be, in this case here, 800,000 euro a year if you are purchasing in this purchase example here. Whereas with the RISE, you don't have that cost protection in the next period. So you need to account for a potential increase. And having been a part of a lot of renegotiations with SAP, we also know the drawbacks of having a locked cost on-premise, because if you made a bad purchase 10 years ago, you'll sort of still have a hangover for it, but at least you have the revenue protected or the cost protected, whereas you don't have that in RISE, basically.
Yeah, so, and also heading into an economic climate that is changing somewhat. Inflation has not been a big theme for the past 10 years. Now it's becoming a big one. So these particular negotiations, these points will become very big deals, is our expectations from what's going to be happening in the next 6 to 18 months.
Yes.
Yeah.
Should we go up here and back?
Definitely, let's do that.
I'll have a few examples here. Are there any?
Yeah, I think just going back to the on-premise alternative, just giving back 2 slides.
Here.
This one, yeah. So some of the pros with that model is that if you have existing installations, the basic rights to get co-financing is a little bit easier. So you have an existing investment in an ECC or just SAP licenses on-premise already. Those transition basically on a one-to-one. SAP has begun to challenge and you need to fight a bit more for getting that value into a RISE setup. So that's a little bit easier. For some of the extensions, the metrics are a little bit different, as Albert said, but we'll just show you that in a second. So for specific products, it might be cheaper in an on-premise version of that. The downsides is, of course, heavy capex investments. It's some big commitments when you're buying up and managing your license portfolio. Sort of, if you don't have proper housekeeping, the on-premise model is still an issue with regards to audits, risks, and so on. So yeah, and then I think for people who are not yet on the S4 license model, just be aware that there's a big difference between the ECC model and the S4 model, where many engines have changed metric and also the price has increased. And in many cases by more than 200%, 230% for some of these supply chain solutions, EWM, transportation management, some of those. But also treasury solutions has increased in price from around 150 to 180%, like for like. So just be aware that you make sure that that's part of your negotiation as well, to make sure that you're mitigating that price increase. And there are we've talked at length about this, how you want to approach that in your negotiations. I'll skip that today, but it's just a part, of course, some of the issues you need to handle if you're buying an on-premise solution instead.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we. Yeah, so some of the issues. This is just. I think actually let's go. Just move on to the next ones, because I think we'll cover the double costs and so on in specific slides as well.
Yes. Then we had the last point around, basically evaluating the cost of upgrading versus also migrating it. And we have a few, a very, very simplified model here on how we would calculate the upgrade or migration project here, right?
Yeah, so this is a medium to large scale SAP installation we've used as an example here. There's a lot of things you need to consider. There will be a lot of assumptions, but estimating this stuff is actually that is doable. But it tends to be significant costs. So of course, definitely when you're looking at RISE, lower implementation cost makes a lot of sense. And also especially for greenfield clients where the benefits of moving old investments into this may be slightly smaller, and you have a more pure competitive situation against an Microsoft AX or Oracle Fusion, whatever ERP solution you might want to consider from Oracle. So in that direct competition scenario, the difference in implementation cost might be a factor, and definitely there's a difference. We have two examples here, and one where you're upgrading, one where you're migrating, and the cost profile tends to be very different. So we just have a breakdown of how those development activities sort of differ in those two cases. I don't think we, also in the interest of time, I think we should move ahead, but this is for those of you where this is a big theme, we'd be happy to share some thoughts on how you might want to approach that.
Yes. Then maybe moving on and diving, in the specifics around the licenses. We could talk at length about the TCOs, but I think we have one also particular deep dive, which is regarding user licenses before we touch upon the terms and conditions. And then, in terms of time, let's just dive into it. But what we do want to spend a bit of time on is what is included in the user license and sort of the main, the FUE here, if you're going into the cloud. I think this is just a figure that sort of illustrates the point here that, of course, when you are evaluating the license cost, again, ensure that when you are looking into cloud, you will have that the main license, or the FUE here, includes more services than the typical user licenses you do have for the core. For instance, you will have the database fee, and you'll have the infrastructure and that included in a lot of the basic licenses. So of course, if you are comparing licenses and license models, then of course ensure that you're comparing, you can say, apples to apples by including the existing cost for infrastructure and the adjacent items here in the comparison if you are looking into on-prem. One of the points here, let me just remove us, is when you are looking into S/4HANA Cloud and RISE here, that is the core product here is license based on the full user equivalent, the FUE, meaning that and that is one license that grants and can be converted to use on specific tables that the SAP has provided. So you'll have that one full user equivalent is basically the same as one HANA for S4 for advanced use. It's also equivalent to 3 core users and 30 self-service users.
Yeah, and those again translate to models that you, some of you will be very familiar with from the ECC Business Suite world: professionals, limited professionals, employees. There are a lot of exceptions to that again, but one of the issues is for clients who are in the ECC or on the S4 contract with not user licenses, but used licenses, with these professional use, functional use, and productivity use licenses. You have an exposure if you're looking at what the license you have on. So you've bought some licenses with some entitlements. What the FUE model as a basis does not take into account is all the special provisions that long-term SAP clients have baked into the commercials around that. And that means that the conversion to FUEs is a potential source of pain and grief commercially, because you will end up overspending on the expensive type. And we'll just show you what that's.
So this is the largest license cost driver, and maybe one of the license cost drivers at all in this. And when you are, so of course also SAP has made the new user licenses also in a way that is not necessarily beneficial for the customer just right off the bat. And one of the things we really want to stress is that whether or not when you're converting from ECC model with professional, limited professional employees and whatnot to S4. In that conversion here, there is a large inherent risk because, as Frederik said, you'll have a lot of entitlement, and the way you translate an old professional license into a professional use license, a functional use license, that is not, there's not one systematic way of doing that, and there's especially no way of doing that so that all your special provisions are taken into account. So by default, that will
Not
just
by
happen.
default. Not by
No,
default.
exactly. No, I think my point is that by default, it will sort of be done via the high bracket, right? Which means that you do need to take all these cases into account to sort of to basically avoid that default scenario of SAP just going in and converting that to the high bracket. So if there's one analysis you need to do, if we could stress that, it would be to ensure that you're getting the right user mix in the new model. And this also translates into if you are converting from S4 and on-premise and into a cloud solution, when you are and then calculating how many FUE licenses you need, because you will have the exact same inherent risk here. And FUE being the largest cost driver, this has a very, very large effect on your overall cost profile. And maybe one very good example is for EWA clients. So I think a lot of the participants we have here will sort of be on an enterprise-wide agreement with SAP, where you will have one user license, covering the entire business, and that user license will have they will have an entitlement that corresponds to a professional license, but it will have a cost that is calculated based on you could say, a mix of entitlements from that you have negotiated with SAP.
Yeah, they're basically, most of you have tried to fit the commercial value and how you're actually using the system into the commercial model in a compromise, but retaining the simple administrative structure where you are licensing your whole organization. And those particular contracts have this risk. We've made sort of an example here and try to make the sort of the numbers simple.
And we're actually taking a quite conservative one here, but this is an example here. If you own 5,000 user licenses on this enterprise-wide agreement, that can be if you purchase that and having a one company license here with a professional entitlement, but the cost of it is calculated based on 50% professional users, 25% limited professional, 25% employee licenses. You'll sort of have one price you've negotiated with SAP on this license. And I think in particularly this mix is very conservative. Typically, you would argue for a lot more limited professional or employee licenses, because that's what you use. You will have a lower price. But just to take a conservative example, this would lead to a price of, I think in total in our example here will be 20.8 million kroner for these user licenses. Because of the license grants that you actually have, because you have the entitlement as a professional user, if you are just taking this to SAP, SAP would convert all of these one-to-one into an FUE, because they would take the entitlement of professional license, and they will say, well, then you need 5,000 FUEs, just as a starting point. And in this cost example here, that means that you will have a 70% increase in the cost. Also, if you take away the other elements that is sort of normalized just to cover the core business and normalized for the infrastructure and whatnot, but that in itself will have a 70% increase in the user cost. Of course, that's not where you end up, because you need to negotiate this with SAP, but this is going to be your starting point in that negotiation if you don't address it right away. So we want to ensure that when we are approaching SAP, we are approaching, or you need to approach them already in the beginning, saying, yes, we need these and these user licenses, but it will be, you base it on the weight of actual entitlements underneath the EWA instead of just the professional license itself.
Yeah. So the basic point here is, if you don't intervene in this process and guide this, what is put into the CRM systems as opportunities will grow greatly. So of course you will then be skilled in negotiating a lot of this, but the starting point is a wrong one, and that makes for suboptimal results. So that's the basic point. So you want to make sure that you're managing this process and you are driving what the conversion should look like, because otherwise then these sort of cartoonish type numbers you will enter into the negotiation, and the issue that the local sales representatives in whether here in Denmark or Norway or Sweden, for the participants here today, well, they will need to explain, given the size that this tends to take on, they will need to answer to the European headquarter in Germany to explain why has this opportunity been downscaled. So say it's 35 million a year, and that goes into a CRM system with a probability of, I don't know, 25, 50%. That is how they approach sort of this weighted pipeline. So it's much easier to scale stuff up afterwards. That's much better for the process than negotiating down. So it goes from being a great story that you are buying all this new stuff into being a terrible one because the original opportunity was 3 times larger than what the deal ended up being. So that's the dynamic you're looking for, and you're looking to avoid starting off on the wrong foot here.
Then we have another example, and our point is that inside of this particular EWA case, it is just that this conversion is the cost implication is very, very sensitive to how you count the different users. So if you have today a mix of entitlements, and if you then see that some of your users are using 1 or 2 maybe minor functionalities, but that actually means that they will be put into another bracket. That has always been a risk in SAP, but in this case, because it in the end just converts into an FUE, and you have, for instance, self-service users are converting into with 30-1, whereas an advanced users are converting with a 1-1. Then having SAP counted this in sort of again in the high bracket means just a few hundred users will have being converted into basically 1-1. The FUE will just have a very, very large dependency on the price itself. Yeah. This has always been a risk. I think the point is, but it's just this conversion is so sensitive to just basically smaller changes in the license entitlements, and you have such a great impact on cost on the other hand, that this is something you would sort of need completely like the EWA to address in the beginning and try to mitigate.
Yeah, and sort of just the simple logic, just so you understand why is that bigger than it used to be. Well, it's basically because, as Albert showed us before, the FUEs are loaded with the database cost and the SAP operations. So from a typical enterprise client, will have 50 to 60% of the cost tied to sort of the user licenses. That's sort of a rule of thumb, 50%. But now, given the same distribution, the cost loaded to the FUEs, which will be the most sensitive and subject to most change over the years, that's loaded with 70% of the cost. And all of a sudden, then you get these exacerbation, both in terms of the classification, which has been skewed towards the more expensive user types, but also that when you are changing user types, the impact, as Albert says, is greater.
Yeah. So be careful.
Yeah, be careful.
It's sort of our main point in this, right? And if there are any one point that really needs your focus on this, this should at least be one of them, or the main one. In terms of time, we have some more details around the conversion and also on the engines as we discussed before. Basically, the point being that, especially if you're coming from an ECC world, you will experience that a lot of the projects cannot be converted 1-1. There will be product upgrades, there'll be more expensive products, there'll be one with another resource unit definition. Also, just because SAP has upgraded it and the functionality in a way that it's just a completely different product, and you sort of need to get your head around that if you are, and need to ensure that the conversion here is something that doesn't make you end up with a lot of high bracket products that you don't really have any value for.
Yeah, I mean, to make it very simple, so if a product changes name to something with S4, look at 2 things. The list price will change and the metric will change. And then the question you should be answering posing internally is, has the business value, has the implementation of this product changed when we're moving to S4? And if that's not the case, well, then your value as a business has not increased. And that is a very, very important argument to carry forward into the negotiation, because there is actually this whole paradigm to manage that internally. So there you're serving up the argumentations for the SAP sales team to align the European organization with why these concessions and discounts have been provided to you. This is an insurance example. It could as well have been utility or retail, industrial goods or whatever. But if you just see that your old product list has changed with the S4 in front of it, look at the metric, look at the list price, and consider whether your business value has changed or not, and your implementation has changed. If it's the same process support you're having, bring that into the negotiation. We'll just show you how in a second.
Yes. Then let's skip to some of the important terms and conditions here, as they are changing quite rapidly from on-premise to cloud.
Yeah, so this is the exciting part where we're flipping through terms in SAP usage rights, which I know is of course a serious cliffhanger from the intro here. There are a number of terms. These are pretty large documents. So the basic point here is that when you're looking at cloud contracts, those are more dynamic. There's a large number of changes also to the on-premise stuff. We've traumatized many of you with the risks of doing that and try to focus your attention to certain areas. When we're talking about the cloud, there's a number of risks that also relate to how the data is being managed, how we're counting stuff, because you're now entering into a paradigm where the transparency around how you as an SAP client is using the system is sort of continuously fed back to SAP. And that means that you have some challenges in terms of how you're managing your estate, but also fundamentally around your security policies that might not align with SAP. So just to introduce a bit of structure to this, we tried to just come up with a list for today around some of the sort of what we see as typically challenging terms in the standard clauses relating to cloud contracts, generally speaking. There are minor differences, but for the sake of simplicity, we've tried to categorize these under a sort of one common banner here. The first one is what we term sort of verification of use. So some of you will also be familiar with Microsoft and this Office 365 type definition, where in the old days you had a named user, and that named user, they could be on several SharePoint sites and so on, but you have a license for those, so you don't need to pay for them several times over. So even though it was already true that the Nordic population was licensed with SAP 3, 4, 5 times over, with all the user licenses bought in private and public sector, what is happening here is that in a cloud setup, SAP is allowed to sort of do a verification of use at any time. The issue with that is that all big organizations will have at least some churn in terms of the user baseline, because people change jobs. For some industries, the churn is great. Professional services firms, this will be very large issue. So for some of these, also big retailers, and so on, will maybe even have a 20% churn. And that means that fundamentally, if you're not able to do the housekeeping so you have a perfectly licensed estate always, that should not be the ambition. So what we're saying here is that you need to manage the audit process in a way where this verification of use is done according to a process that you're able to support, so that the cleanup is done maybe once a year, and then you submit numbers. Because I mean, you will have certain periods, a lot of people starting in January or after the summer break or something, and then you'll have a spike in users, and then you'll need to clean that up before you're at a sort of a net number of people on the system. Fundamentally, they are able to send you a bill for your overusage at any given time. This is not being pursued very aggressively, but the math dictates that this is potentially a big risk. So if you enter into a period of less growth in your SAP engagement, audit is a familiar weapon to sort of drive the client to maybe adopt functionality slightly earlier than what the business is dictating. So this is an important one to clean up in the standard terms. And also when they are counting users, traditional SAP, the licensing, when you remind the auditors how it's actually supposed to be done, is actually the active users. So in the cloud system, they will take the gross number, and to make your life a little easier, you could work with these authorized user clauses just to make those a little bit easier to manage and get the definition back to active users, because that also mitigates some of the risk you have with this verification of use. That yes, there'll always be a housekeeping issue, but we are looking at it from this perspective, people actually using and interacting with the system rather than and interaction will be just one execution on the system in this definition. The standard DPA is subject to change. That's not something that most big corporations thinks is a great idea and probably not palatable. That is definitely something you can change, but just be aware that that is actually what you are signing up for if you are getting a free POC of some sort of a cloud product. Just be aware, because that will very quickly turn into a master agreement.
It's rarely you see that in contracts, right? That the standard DPA you sign is subject to change.
Yeah. So there is basically a reference to a homepage where your website where you can see how that is changing, but you basically don't know what the DPA is, which we find interesting at least. And that's also because in the cloud terms they have this modification of policies, so they are actually allowed to change that on an ongoing basis. We would always recommend clients, even though that's tedious and boring and potentially a waste of paper, but at least get a copy of the available cloud terms that are relevant for this particular purchase, so you know what you're allowed to do inside this purchase you have.
We have
only
a few minutes more left. I think let's run through some of. We have one more slide here around the terms and conditions, and then maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Unfortunately, for questions, we don't have if there's any one of you have slightly more time, please stay around for any of the questions, and we're happy to answer them. We might not be. This may just be the next one. May just be the last slide that we get to, but then we can come back to the negotiation with the SAP on RISE.
Yeah.
At a later point.
Definitely, and I think the other ones here are around how you're protecting your data. That might be an issue. Repricing, we covered that, but that is a right of them to change the pricing at renewal, at least with these relatively aggressive price hikes. Uptime commitment, that was around how you're measuring downtime, which might not make a whole lot of sense if you're doing that annually or biannually on an average. So potentially change that. Let's just take the next one. I'll highlight the 1 or 2 that makes sense. The issue for payment is renewal. I covered that, so that's just you might already be into a new cycle if you're only looking at the contracts 6 months before it expires. Just be aware that it might not make sense for you. An interesting definition is this overcommitment. So we're actually in a cloud system where you should have a more flexible purchase of licenses. But if you don't change the standard terms, there's no excess. So it means that you cannot return licenses subscriptions before. So if you're signing up for 5 years and you've bought licenses for 5,000, but you only need 4,500, well, you cannot reduce the subscriptions until the annuity of that, unless you change this clause. So it's less the cloud should be flexible. It can be, but you just need to make sure you have the flexibility in the model still. I think those are some of the main ones. There is a lot of other stuff around M&A clauses, payment plans, and that sort of stuff. That tends to be very specific, but this is just to give you an idea of some of the things you should be considering when you're getting the general terms and conditions. So make sure you know which ones are relevant for the contract term you're signing up for, and make sure you have understand the commercial flexibility. Then you'll be in a good position to handle that. And then, of course, security. The DPA might not align with how you see the world. So that is a question for your legal team to evaluate. I think, as always, we might have been a bit too ambitious with all the things we wanted to talk about. We didn't cover the negotiation too much, but this is sort of the core of what you need to look at in terms of getting to a better place with your RISE consideration. It might be definitely the right option for you, but just understand that these differences in the structure makes for pros and cons for your particular organization. And we hope this was helpful, at least initially, to give you an overview of what you need to look at. And hopefully we've simplified at least some of this discussion for you a little bit. And we'd be happy to elaborate if that was relevant.
Yeah, so
I don't know if you have some questions.
Yes, please. I mean, and again, please write Marianne if you want the material for today. We'll send it over. Or if you have any specific questions that you're struggling with, or any conversion or analysis with SAP, also just please let us know. We're happy to share.
Until next time, thanks a lot for your time, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.